This episode contains graphic content that may not be suitable for all ages. Listener discretion is advised. If you or someone you know is struggling or in crisis, help is available. Call or text 988 or chat with someone at 988lifeline.org. Those outside of the US, reach out to someone at your local crisis center or hotline. Please do not suffer in silence. The dawn of June 10th, 1912, broke gently over Villisca, Iowa. The first shafts of sun struck the white clapboard houses of East 2nd Street, and for a while, everything seemed exactly as it should be. The lilacs in the yards were heavy with bloom. A rooster crowed somewhere behind the grain elevator. It was an ordinary Monday in a town that believed itself protected from anything truly terrible. At 7:30 that morning, Mary Peckham stepped out her back door to hang her laundry. Her house stood next to the Moore family, close enough that she could usually hear the soft chaos of their mornings. The mother, Sarah Moore, bustling in the kitchen, the scrape of chairs, the rising laughter of children who always seemed half ready for school. The Moores were early risers, and their routine rarely varied. That morning, though, the house next door was silent. The stillness unsettled Mary Peckham. Sarah Moore, her neighbor's matriarch, wasn't the kind of woman to sleep in, especially on a Monday. Mary lingered on her porch, folding and unfolding a towel in her hands. The Moores' blinds were drawn, their curtains closed tight. Even the chickens in the yard had not been fed, so Mary waited another half an hour before knocking on the door. No one answered. She circled to the back and tried again. Still nothing. The screen door was latched from the inside. Mary cupped her hands against the glass, trying to see through, but the shades had been pulled down. She knocked harder, saying, "Sarah, Mr. Moore," but the sound went nowhere. It was then that she walked briskly down the street to find Josiah Moore's brother, Ross. He was the kind of man everyone in Villisca called when something needed sorting out, level-headed, reliable. When Mary reached his store, she told him, "Ross, something's wrong at Joe's house. They're not up, and the doors are all locked." Ross left immediately, his key in his pocket. By the time he and Mary reached the Moore home, the morning sun had climbed over the rooftops. Ross knocked loudly. Again, no response. So he turned the key in the front lock, stepped into the parlor, and called out into the dimness. The air inside was heavy. The shades were drawn. A faint, metallic odor lingered. He took a few cautious steps toward the guest bedroom. The door was half closed. Through the crack, he saw what looked like two shapes in the bed, covered from head to foot with a sheet. He pushed the door open. The scene that met him froze him in place. Ross Moore stumbled backward, out onto the porch, pale and shaking. "Mary," he said, his voice trembling. "Call the marshal. Tell him to come quick. There's something awful in there." That morning, as Marshal Hank Horton walked the quiet path toward the Moore home, Villisca was still unaware that its innocence had ended forever. This is the story of the Villisca Axe Murders, Part 1, A Town Asleep. Nestled in the gentle hills of southwest Iowa, Villisca was the sort of place that made its living from the land and its comfort from community. About 2,500 people called it home. The railroad cut through its southern edge, bringing goods, news, and the occasional traveler. 2 banks, 3 churches, a handful of general stores, and a tidy row of shops framed the town square. Residents prided themselves on their town's moral character. They were farmers, merchants, teachers, preachers, descendants of the first settlers that had broken the prairie sod 50 years earlier. Sundays were sacred, and gossip was the nearest thing to scandal. The Villisca Review chronicled the rhythm of their lives. Ice socials, harvest fairs, new births. The biggest headlines were about the price of corn or the arrival of a new automobile. Crime barely registered. The sheriff mostly dealt with runaway livestock and the occasional drunk on Main Street. There was a sense, common in rural America at the time, that small towns were immune to the darkness that plagued cities. The people of Villisca often left their doors unlocked and their windows open to the summer air. Neighbors borrowed flour without asking. Strangers were rare, but not necessarily unwelcome. The town's name itself, Villisca, was believed to come from a native word meaning pleasant view. It seemed fitting, a place of peace and prosperity, where the fields stretched wide and the world felt steady. No one could have imagined that within a single night, the town's very name would become synonymous with horror. Josiah Joe Moore was a man who had built his life the old-fashioned way, through diligence, trust, and faith. Born in 1868, he had come to Villisca as a young man and found work at the local hardware store owned by Frank F. Jones. Moore was quick-witted and good with customers. For nearly a decade, he was Jones' best employee, and the two men were close, until Joe decided to strike out on his own. In 1908, he opened the J.B. Moore hardware store just off Villisca's town square. It prospered quickly, and in winning the local John Deere contract, a valuable piece of business previously held by Jones, Moore's independence became permanent. Though Jones remained publicly civil, there was talk of resentment. In a small town, even polite rivalries carry sharp edges. At home, Moore was known as a family man. He and his wife, Sarah Montgomery Moore, had been married for 13 years and had 4 children. Sarah, 39, was the heart of the family. She played the organ at the Presbyterian Church and led the Ladies' Aid Society. Friends described her as calm and soft-spoken, the sort of woman who could organize a community event without raising her voice. Their children, Herman, 11, Catherine, 10, Boyd, 7, and Paul, 5, filled the house with noise and light. Herman was Ernest, the quiet helper who shadowed his father at the hardware store. Catherine had her mother's poise and her father's humor. Boyd and Paul were inseparable, often seen racing their bicycles down 2nd Street. Photographs from that spring show a happy, ordinary family. Josiah with his trimmed mustache and bowler hat. Sarah in her white lace blouse. The children gathered close in Sunday clothes. On the evening of June 9th, 1912, the Moores welcomed 2 guests into their home, Lena and Ina Stillinger, daughters of Joe and Sarah Stillinger, who lived a few miles away. The Stillinger girls were sweet-natured and well-behaved. Lena was 12, the elder, protective of her younger sister. The invitation had been spontaneous. After the Sunday evening church program, the Moore children wanted their friends to stay the night rather than walk home in the dark. Their parents agreed. It was a small kindness, the sort that happens every day in a trusting town, and it sealed the girls' fates. Sunday, June 9th, was one of the most cheerful days of the year for Villisca's Presbyterian Church. The annual Children Day program was a fixture of early summer, a mix of scripture recitations, songs, and simple plays celebrating youth and faith. Sarah Moore had spent weeks preparing the event. She had written notes for each child's part, arranged flowers, and made sure that the youngest knew their lines. It was the kind of wholesome celebration that defined small-town life in the early 1900s. So the Moores rose early that morning. The family walked to church together for Sunday service, returned home for lunch, and then spent the afternoon relaxing and preparing for the evening's festivities. The Stillinger girls joined them later in the afternoon, dressed neatly in light-colored dresses, their hair tied with ribbons. That evening the church was full. Neighbors fanned themselves against the June heat. The children performed from a small stage decorated with garlands and banners reading, "Suffer the little children to come unto me." The program began at 8 o'clock and ended at around 9:30. Among those in attendance was a traveling preacher named Reverend George Kelly, a wiry Englishman known for his odd mannerisms and nervous energy. No one gave him much notice that night. When the final hymn concluded, the Moores lingered to chat with friends and congratulate the children. They were among the last to leave the church, walking home with the 2 Stillinger girls through the dimly lit streets. It was a cool, quiet evening. The walk took less than 10 minutes. At around 10 o'clock, the family reached their front porch. Josiah unlocked the door. Sarah lit a lamp, and the household settled in for the night. Upstairs, beds creaked as children whispered to one another, retelling moments from the evening, the songs, the laughter. Outside, the last train of the night passed through Villisca, its whistle echoing faintly across the sleeping town, and in one of the houses along its track, a stranger might have been waiting. Now we return to the morning of June 10th, 1912, when neighbor Mary Peckham grew suspicious of the quiet surrounding the Moore property and sought help. When Marshal Hank Horton crossed the threshold of the Moore house, the air inside was heavy, stale, and unnaturally still. He moved through the narrow parlor, where a child's coat hung neatly on a peg, a reminder that the home had been ordinary just a few hours earlier. Horton carried a kerosene lamp in one hand. The curtains inside the house were drawn, the rooms cloaked in half-darkness. In the guest bedroom, he found two small figures in the bed, their faces hidden beneath bedclothes. He lifted the corner of the sheet and stepped back immediately. The scene before him was worse than he ever could have imagined. Upstairs, he found much of the same. The Moore family, each in their own beds. The rooms looked undisturbed, as though the family had fallen asleep and never stirred again. Every mirror in the house had been covered. The curtains were all drawn. Doors locked from the inside. Marshal Hank Horton left the house quickly. On the porch, his hands were shaking. He told Josiah's brother Ross, "Don't let anyone else in. This is bad, very bad." But already, people were gathering. The sound of women weeping carried down the street. Neighbors pressed to the porch, whispering, demanding to know what had happened. Horton tried to hold them back, but the crowd grew faster than the law could contain it. By midday, dozens, then perhaps hundreds, had entered the house. They filed through the rooms in disbelief, trampling footprints across the floors, touching objects, lifting sheets, speaking in hushed tones that seemed out of place among the dead. When the county coroner finally arrived, he found chaos. Any evidence that might have once been there was gone. Once the building was cleared, officials began their work. The coroner, the sheriff, and the county attorney spent hours documenting what they could still observe. Their notes read like an autopsy of a nightmare. The doors had been locked from within. Windows were closed, shades drawn tightly. Lamps had been adjusted so that their light was minimal. The chimneys removed, the wicks turned low. In the kitchen, a plate of food sat untouched on the table, beside a bowl of murky water. The axe, the murder weapon, wiped but not cleaned, leaned against the wall in the guest room. What puzzled investigators most was the calm of the setting. There were no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no indication that anyone had been awakened in time to fight back. Whatever had happened had unfolded quickly and seemingly quietly. The coroner concluded that the family and their two young guests had all died in their sleep. He found evidence that the killer had taken care afterward to cover the victims' faces, a gesture that no one could explain. And then there were the smaller mysteries. Mirrors covered with clothing. Curtains pinned shut with household objects, as if to ensure that not a single beam of light escaped the house. Each clue raised more questions than it answered. By the afternoon of June 10th, the story had swept through Villisca like wildfire. Neighbors spoke of it in disbelief, their voices low, as though the sound itself might awaken something dreadful. Sheriff Orrin Jackson arrived from Red Oak to take charge. He found the house already compromised. Footprints from curious townspeople everywhere. Evidence handled, even removed. Still, the investigators began piecing together a timeline. Based on the state of the bodies, the doctor estimated that the deaths had occurred sometime after midnight. A kerosene lamp left near the bed suggested that whoever had done this had moved carefully, using only the dimmest light. In the attic, the sheriff found a box of cigarette butts. It was the first solid clue. a sign that someone may have hidden there, waiting for the family to return from the church program. How long they had waited, or why they had chosen that night, no one knew. The back door had been locked from the inside. There were faint traces of mud near the porch steps, though whether they came from the killer or the crowds that followed was impossible to tell. The investigators stepped outside, blinking into the bright afternoon. The street was still thick with people, each carrying their own theory. Someone muttered that a stranger had been seen near the depot at dawn. Another swore he'd heard footsteps in his yard that night. Before the day was over, Villisca's sense of safety had vanished. That evening, as the sun went down, every household in Villisca locked its doors. Windows were bolted, curtains drawn. The trust that had defined the town evaporated in a single day. Men sat up through the night with rifles across their knees. Dogs barked at shadows. The whistle of a passing train made people flinch. Rumors began immediately. Some said the killer must have fled on the early morning train, escaping before sunrise. Others believed he was still hiding somewhere nearby, maybe in a barn, a field, perhaps another attic. A search party formed before midnight, lanterns bobbing through the darkness. They combed the roads and rail lines, finding nothing. By dawn, the searchers returned home exhausted, their torches guttering out one by one. Villisca was no longer a quiet town. It was now a town on guard. By the next morning, reporters had arrived. The Omaha Bee, the Des Moines Register, and the Kansas City Star all sent correspondence by train. Within a day, Villisca's streets were crowded with strangers. Not only journalists, but curiosity seekers and self-appointed detectives. Photographers set up tripods outside the Moore home, recording the grief of the town people who gathered in stunned silence. The newspapers called it a slaughter beyond understanding. Headlines described a human fiend, the work of a madman, the worst crime in Iowa's history. But beyond the sensational language, there was little clarity. Attorney General Howard Clark traveled from Des Moines to assist. He walked through the house, examined the walls still darkened by blood, and admitted privately that the case might never be solved. The man who did this knew what he was doing, Clark told the press. He left nothing of himself behind. What evidence remained was fragmentary. A few footprints, a smudged lantern, a weapon that belonged to the victims themselves. It was the sort of crime for which the early 20th century had no tools. 2 days after the discovery, on June 12th, the entire town gathered for the funeral. The services for the Moore and Stillinger families were held together at the Methodist Church. Every pew was filled. Hundreds more stood outside in the summer heat, hats in hand, listening through open windows. The 8 caskets were arranged in 2 rows, covered in flowers. Reverend Ewing, the same minister who had led the Joyful Children's Day program just nights earlier, now stood before his congregation to speak of loss too large to measure. He did not speak of the killer. He spoke instead of innocence, his voice trembling. We must remember them as they were. This is a darkness that no one here deserved, but we must not let it unmake our faith in one another. As the procession moved from the church to the cemetery, the town fell silent except for the slow creak of wagon wheels. The graves were dug side by side, the Moores and the Stillinger sisters separated by only a few feet of earth. More than 5,000 mourners attended, twice Villisca's population. Many stayed long after the coffins were lowered, as though unwilling to let the families vanish from sight. The Moore home on 2nd Street was sealed afterward, its windows boarded and its door locked. Few could bear to pass it. By midsummer, wildflowers had begun to grow in the yard. The grass was uncut. The house now stood like a monument to something that no one in town could name. By the end of the first week, Villisca was no longer a town of 2,000, but a makeshift command post for chaos. Trains arrived daily carrying detectives and journalists. Horses lined the main street. People who had never before heard of Montgomery County, Iowa, now debated the details of its dead. Sheriff Orrin Jackson coordinated what passed for the investigation. He was methodical and careful, but unprepared for a crime that seemed beyond the boundaries of small-town reason. The state sent assistance, but the state itself had little to offer. Forensic science in 1912 was a crude thing. There were no crime labs, no fingerprint files, no understanding of criminal profiling. Investigators mostly relied on intuition, rumor, and what little they could see. So Sheriff Jackson began by retracing the family's last day. He questioned parishioners from the Presbyterian Church, confirmed that the Moores had left the Children's Day service close to 10 o'clock p.m., and then walked home along 2nd Street with the Stillinger girls in tow. Several witnesses recalled seeing them pass under the gas lamps, Josiah carrying a small lantern, Sarah's hand resting gently on Catherine's shoulder. That was the last verified sighting of any of them. From there, Jackson tried to reconstruct the hours that followed. Based on body temperature and the condition of the remains, the coroner placed the time of death between midnight and 2 a.m. No one in the neighborhood reported screams or gunfire. One neighbor claimed to have heard a faint thud in the night, but thought that it was a horse kicking a stall. Whoever had entered the Moore home had done so with uncanny silence. The attic discovery, a box of cigarette butts, became the first meaningful lead. Investigators theorized that the killer had hidden there before the family came home, waiting for the lamps to dim. But this too was speculation. The attic could have been used earlier that evening by one of the Moore children. A second clue was more tangible: the locked doors. Every exit had been secured from the inside, and only the front key, later recovered, could open them. If the killer had locked the house behind him, how had he done so without leaving a trace? The answer eluded them. Every physical piece of evidence was compromised. Dozens of visitors had tracked footprints through the rooms before the lawmen arrived. Items had been moved, some even stolen. A local man bragged in a nearby saloon that he had taken a piece of the Moore wallpaper as a souvenir. Jackson's frustration boiled over in one recorded remark: "We're looking for one man, and we've got 2,000 in the way." As weeks passed, the investigation widened beyond Montgomery County. Sheriff Jackson began tracing reports from nearby towns. A farmer in Macedonia, Iowa, claimed to have seen a man walking along the railroad tracks at dawn on June 10th, carrying a bundle wrapped in cloth. Others recalled a stranger loitering near the depot the evening before. None of these sightings could be verified. Then came the comparisons. In the months leading up to the Villisca murders, similar crimes had occurred across the Midwest. Whole families bludgeoned in their sleep, often near railroad lines. The newspapers listed them side by side, calling it a Midwestern plague. Investigators wondered whether Villisca was part of a pattern. Maybe a killer traveling by train, choosing isolated homes near depots, striking without warning, and then vanishing into the next town before dawn. But even this theory had holes. There was no clear description of a suspect, no physical evidence to tie one case to another. The alternative was more frightening, that the killer had not traveled at all, but lived among them. By late summer, talk turned inward. Some townspeople whispered the name of Frank Jones, Josiah Moore's former employer. Their business relationship had soured years before when Moore left to open his own store. Jones, a respected state senator, denied any animosity. But in private, people wondered whether bitterness had survived beneath the surface. Then there was the traveling preacher, Reverend George Kelly. Nervous, eccentric, always watching. He had been in the church the night before the murders, left town by the early train the next morning, and soon after began sending letters to investigators. Strange letters describing the crime in detail, claiming visions from God. At the time, few took him seriously. Villisca was full of frightened people, and Kelly seemed only another oddity in a town already drowning in them. Still, his name lingered in notebooks and margins. A curiosity that would, years later, grow into something much larger. By the end of 1912, the investigation had stalled. The crowds were gone, the newspapers had moved on, but the town could not forget. The Moore house stood empty through the winter. Children avoided the block entirely. Adults crossed to the other side of the street. Some said the sound of footsteps could be heard inside late at night, though no one was brave enough to go and check. The townspeople, once united by friendship and church gatherings, grew suspicious of one another. Neighbors who had once shared meals together now locked their doors and avoided conversation. One local editorial captured it best. "It is not only that 8 have died, it is that the peace of Villisca has been murdered too." The killer was gone, whether by train, by horse, or on foot, no one could say. But the silence they left behind stretched longer than any trail of evidence, and the case, unsolved, was far from over. The murder transformed Villisca from an obscure farm town into a national fascination. Reporters arrived from as far as Chicago and New York. They roamed the streets, interviewed weeping neighbors, and published daily updates that mixed fact with theater. The Des Moines Register described the crime scene in grotesque detail. The Kansas City Star speculated about a mad slayer who drifted from town to town. The Omaha Bee suggested it was the work of an enemy known to the family. Each newspaper told a different version of the same story, and each version spread faster than the truth. Photographers snapped images of the Moore house, its curtains still drawn, its porch crowded with onlookers. One journalist noted, "Never in Iowa's history has a single home drawn so many eyes and so many questions." The attention brought interference as well. Theories multiplied. False confessions poured in. A transient in Missouri claimed to be the killer, but his timeline did not match. A man in Kansas was arrested for carrying a bloody axe, which turned out to be from slaughtering hogs. The story had become a bit of a national mirror. Everyone saw what they wanted to see. But for the people who lived in Villisca, the attention was unbearable. The Moore's friends and family were interrogated repeatedly. Sarah Moore's relatives were followed by reporters to neighboring towns. Shopkeepers complained that visitors came not to buy goods but to hear gossip. Farmers from miles around arrived by wagon just to stand outside the house, peering through its blank windows. Many residents resented the outsiders. Others, of course, courted them, offering wild theories in exchange for a mention in print. The town's moral center, once rooted in mutual trust, began to slowly erode. The sheriff's office, overwhelmed, offered a $1,000 reward for information leading to the arrest of the killer. No one claimed it. As weeks began to turn into months, Villisca settled into a tense normalcy. The Moore house was boarded up, its furniture removed, its rooms empty except for the memory of what had happened there. But in kitchens and shops, people in town still whispered names. Among the whispers, one name came up more often than the others, that of Frank F. Jones. Jones was a prominent Villisca businessman and a respected Iowa state senator. Years earlier, Josiah Moore had worked for him in the Jones hardware store. When Moore left to open his own business, he took with him several key accounts, including the lucrative John Deere contract. That loss stung. In towns like Villisca, business rivalries often carried the weight of family betrayals, so rumor held that Jones never forgave Josiah. Some claimed that the two men no longer spoke. Others said that their feud was exaggerated. The truth likely lay somewhere in between, cool civility masking quiet resentment. Detectives considered whether Jones could have hired someone to exact revenge, but he had a solid reputation and no history of violence. The theory lingered mostly because it made emotional sense. Villisca could more easily believe in human envy than in random evil. Frank F. Jones denied any involvement, calling the suggestion itself absurd and cruel. Still, the suspicion lingered in whispers, a stain that would shadow his family for years. Late that summer, new information reached the sheriff's office. In other towns across the Midwest, eerily similar crimes had been reported. In Colorado Springs, a family of 6 had been bludgeoned in their sleep with an axe. In Ellsworth, Kansas, and Paola, Kansas, similar attacks had left entire households dead. The similarities were uncanny. Curtains drawn, lamps extinguished, mirrors covered. Each scene lay within walking distance of a trail line. Each killer had left the murder weapon behind. Each had struck between midnight and dawn. Newspapers began to link the events together, suggesting the work of a traveling murderer, a phantom who moved with the trains. For Sheriff Jackson, the idea was both terrifying and relieving. It meant Villisca might not have been singled out, that the killer could be a stranger, not one of their own. But it also meant that he was chasing a ghost across hundreds of miles of railroad tracks. Lawmen in multiple states began exchanging telegrams and comparing notes. Nothing concrete emerged. There were no fingerprints to match together, no photographs of suspects. The pattern was chilling, but it was mostly intangible, a rumor that refused to dissolve. The first time anyone seriously considered Reverend George Kelly a suspect, it was not because of what he had done in Villisca, but because of what he said afterward. Kelly was an English-born itinerant preacher in his 30s, small and nervous, with wire spectacles and a voice that rose and fell like a question. He had attended the Children's Day program on the evening of June 9th, sitting alone in the back pew. The next morning he took the early train out of town, at precisely 5:19 a.m., less than 4 hours before the bodies were discovered. Weeks later, he began sending letters to law enforcement, claiming that God had shown him visions of the crime. He described the scene in detail, including information that had not been publicly released. Some investigators suspected inside knowledge. Others thought he was simply obsessed with the case. Kelly's mental health had long been a concern. He was known to write inappropriate letters to young women, and was briefly committed to a mental institution years earlier. Still in 1912, he was not formally accused of any crime. Theories about him would grow over the next few years, until 5 years later they would bring him back to Iowa in handcuffs. But that was still far ahead. For now, Villisca only knew him as the strange little preacher who had passed through town the night everything changed. Autumn came early that year, the fields turning gold around a town that no longer trusted the dark. By then, the investigation had stalled completely. The $1,000 reward remained unclaimed. Any leads that may have once existed had grown cold. The Attorney General returned to Des Moines, and reporters stopped arriving on the morning trains. In October of 1912, Sheriff Jackson wrote a final summary to the state office. In it he wrote, "All persons examined, no arrest, no new evidence." The Moore home remained empty through the winter, its white paint peeled in the wind, its curtains still drawn tight. Children said they could see shapes in the windows at night, shadows moving inside. Adults laughed nervously when they repeated the stories, but avoided the street all the same. The Moore's relatives sold what they could and left town. The Stillingers stayed, quiet and withdrawn. For the rest of their lives, they refused to speak publicly about that night. By 1913, Villisca was a ghost of itself. The longer the case went unsolved, the heavier its silence became. Church attendance dropped. Businesses closed early. The town's population began to shrink. Families who could afford to move did so. In just 2 years, Villisca lost nearly 10% of its residents. Those who stayed learned to live with suspicion. Neighbors watched each other through lace curtains. Outsiders were questioned, then avoided. The town's sense of community, its most defining quality, had been fractured. An editorial in the Red Oak Express put it bluntly, "The tragedy at Villisca has cut a scar through the heart of rural Iowa. It is not the work of a single night, but the work of a decade to mend it. But even a decade would not be enough." Every few months, news of another axe murder arrived from somewhere along the rail line. Illinois, Kansas, Missouri. Each new report revived old fears. Some of these same detectives who had walked through the Moore home now traveled from state to state comparing notes, searching for a thread that might tie them together. They, unfortunately, did not find much. By 1915, the Villisca murders had become folklore. A cautionary tale of darkness invading decency. But for all the talk, one fact never changed. No one had ever been charged. And the evidence, such as it was, lay locked away in dusty boxes in the Montgomery County Courthouse. In the years that followed, the house stood empty, quietly decaying. The porch sagged. Grass grew tall around the steps. The white walls that had once echoed with children's laughter became a symbol of what the town had lost. In time, it became less a home than a monument. Not to horror exactly, but to a mystery that refused to fade. Five years would pass before the name of Reverend George Kelly resurfaced in headlines. Before confessions, trials, and new suspects reopened the wounds Villisca had tried to close. The killer's identity remained unsolved, but the obsession with it had only just begun. As one newspaper would write in 1917, Villisca cannot sleep, for the axe still hangs above its dreams. And so the story continued. From whispered rumor to courtroom spectacle. From forgotten files to modern myth. What began as a single night of horror would stretch across a century of questions, each one leading back to the same quiet house on East 2nd Street. That's on the next episode of Unresolved. Thank you for listening to this episode of Unresolved. I have been your host, Micheal Whelan. Research, writing, and production for this podcast was handled by myself, as Unresolved is a fully independent production. To help keep it that way, please head over to Patreon where you can help support the show and receive additional content in return. There you can get access to the vault of exclusive bonus episodes. Stories like the Coast to Coast AM Area 51 caller, or the creepy Cape intruder, as well as every episode of Resolved, where I tackle solved cases. I have a special bonus episode for Halloween coming out soon. You don't want to miss that, as well as the conclusion to my BTK Resolved series, which I know has taken a bit longer than anyone expected, but is just about finished. Once again, you can get access to all of those over on Patreon at the link below in the show notes. There on Patreon, you can also become a producer of the show, like these amazing people. You have Roberta Jansen, Sarah Moscaratolo, Ben Crocum, Scott Meesey, Marion Welsh, Jacinta Class, Crystal J, Lauren Nicole, James Weiss, Alex Kalogeropoulos, Stacey Hauser, Stephen Diaz, Kevin Tweedy, Heather Fiddler, Anna T, Cece, Tabitha Colvin, Trixie Fink, and Marcus Mitchell. Thank you all for your support, and thank you all for listening. The second half of this story will be out this week, just in time for Halloween, and I hope until then you all stay safe, stay healthy, and stay aware. I'll talk to you all soon. Bye.